Shalom. So tonight I want to talk about another potentially sacred place, and that's the table. The table we eat around. And why is that such a interesting place? Think of what goes on around the table. What can we do around the table? There's a flow of life. The flow of life in that we can eat something and then we're more alive. We can be hungry and then we eat and then we're not hungry because we're more alive. It can also be the opposite. We can be decreasing life, right? You eat something and you, God forbid, you choke and you die, or you eat something that's not healthy for you and you're less alive after that. So there's already a tension in that. And that's only when you're alone. Often we have other people around the table. What can you do with other people around the table? You can give them life. How do you give them life? You open up your table to them. You're a host. You're giving food, hospitality. There's physical food and lots of other kinds of sustenance and love going on around the table. That's a giving of life. And there's the dark side of that also. You could be poisoning them. You could be you have a knife in your hand when you're eating. You could stab them, right? Always when there's people around the table eating, there has to be a level of trust in order to enable the eating together to happen. Now, we've said before that anywhere where there's a certain amount of tension, that's an opportunity for a sacred space to arise. Why? Because there's an opportunity there to go beyond yourself, to be vulnerable, but to go beyond yourself, and there's an opportunity to fail, to not go beyond yourself, right? So that kind of potential sacredness. When does that happen? For example, when you eat food and you're thankful for it. And you eat food, you realize it could be otherwise. You could not be eating that food. And that opens up something beyond yourself, and you're thankful to it. You're thankful. Just a feeling of thankfulness. If you're religious, if you're boring and religious like me, then you direct this thankfulness into a fixed formula, and you say thank you to God, right? And maybe it's not as obvious as I'd like it to be, that just eating and enjoying things in the world is part of the religious life. It's part of the religious experience. It's almost the first commandment in the Torah, right? When Adam is in the Garden of Eden, God says, eat from any of these trees. We usually focus on the next verse. It says, no, except for the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, don't eat from there. But before that, the normal state of being is, you should eat. Enjoy everything. Right? Why did God create a garden? To enjoy. And we see that also in all the blessings. Right? We bless God. We bless God also because there's a sense of thankfulness, like I said, but there's also something else. There's also, I learned from a teacher of mine that, I should say the name, from Raz, that when you have this blessing for bread, you bless God. Baruch atah, you bless God. Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, who brings bread out of the earth. What does it mean that we're describing God as bringing bread out of the earth? Bread doesn't come out of the earth. Wheat comes out of the earth. Right? For bread to happen, there's a whole set of 11 7 different processes of reaping and sorting and grinding and mixing and baking, right? All of that has to happen in order for bread to come out of the earth, which means that anyone involved in that, anyone involved in making bread and preparing food at all, is also doing God's job and manifesting God's will in bringing bread out of the earth. And there's this kind of this two-way relationship with food that links people and God. Right? We spoke about thanks. We read in the Shiur an amazing book by Rabbeinu Bechaya ben Asher, who writes all sorts of things to do with the table. Right? A book called Shulchan Shel Arba, where he talks about the different laws around the table and customs around the table and Kabbalah and mystical intentions around the table. And it says anyone who's just eating, just is hungry and fills their hunger with food, it's as if they're eating blood. He calls them blood eaters. And anyone who thinks about what's happening with their food, he calls that achila vada'it, real eating. Real eating. He talks about drinking the wine of the intellect. Right? But what's interesting here is he's not saying that the wine of, he talks about wine of lust and wine of intellect. Right? He's not saying like the real wine, like the actual bottle you have, that's wine of lust, and you should just be meditating, and that's the wine of the intellect. No, he's saying you drink the actual wine, but if you feel that, if you experience that as an act of worship, then that's the wine of the intellect. If you're not thinking, then you're eating blood and you're drinking wine of lust. And I encourage everyone to look in the source sheet for his whole description of what's happening on the festivals, when food is brought to the temple, right? All these agricultural festivals that now we think are historical, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot. He says it's all about giving some food back to God, to encourage God to give food back to us. It's an act of giving, and that act of giving, receiving, that flow also happens in hospitality. The Talmud says that in the past we had the temple with an altar that would atone for people. Today we have a table that atones for people. How does the table atone? Through inviting guests, through welcoming guests. You bring guests into your temple, and then every piece of food that you share with them, that's a sacrifice. A sacrifice not in a difficult way. It's a sacrifice in terms of like that's the worship, the being more than yourself is giving away your food for someone else. And that maybe I'll finish with some words of Maimonides, and I try to teach this. I try to learn this every festival. Okay, to remember this every festival, and also I teach it when I'm in the position of teaching. And when Rambam writes about the laws of the festival, chapter 6, Halacha 18, he finishes with this: while eating and drinking, one must feed the stranger, the orphan, the widow, the other poor unfortunates. Anyone, however, who locks the doors of his courtyard and eats and drinks along with his wife and children, without giving anything to eat and drink to the poor and the desperate, does not observe a religious celebration, but indulges in the celebration of his stomach. This kind of happiness is a curse, as it says, um, I will strew dung upon your faces, the dung of your festival sacrifices, right? If you're just eating on the festivals, then what have you done? There's no. If you're not sharing with other people, you're not sharing with God. God, there's nothing spiritual. There's nothing religious about what you're doing. You're just eating. If you're sharing, then there's a religious celebration that can happen there. Now, easier to say than to do, right? There's always limits on giving. Um, it's also difficult to receive, but uh, but that's what's going on at the table. At the table, there's all these possibilities of wonderful things to happen, and we just have to live up. We have to live up to those opportunities. Take them. Every meal is an opportunity to have not just have an experience. It's not just about me. It's to leave myself, to be more than myself, to transcend. Anyway, I'll finish with that. I encourage you to read the source sheet, and thank you for listening.